Every once in a while, somebody will say something to the effect that, I wish that God would come down and take care of this, that, or the other thing, or make his presence known to the world in an unmistakable way. Well, I must tell you that he did come down, and he does come down. Many people don't notice him. When he came 2,000 years ago in the form of a man whom we call Jesus, people were very critical of him. And one of the points of criticism was that Jesus could not possibly be as great as Moses, who founded the Jewish religion, because in Moses' day, he was responsible for a miracle which involved this bread-like substance falling from the sky, which the people ate because they had no other food. So what the people were doing in Jesus' time was basically saying, look, if you're as great as Moses, you need to repeat this miracle. And Jesus said to them something very strange on the surface. He said, I am the bread come down from heaven. He is the one whom God sent. And he went on to talk about eating his flesh. Now, the thing is, in the Western world, it might be a better translation to say that Jesus is food. But what do we mean by that? Because on the surface, nobody can really make that claim except for Jesus. And here's how we understand it. When Mother Teresa came to the U.S., at one point, she said that she found more spiritual malnourishment in New York than in Calcutta. Meaning to say that without Jesus, we are hungering, we are malnourished. So how does he feed us? With his person, his truth, his love, his forgiveness, his peace, his encouragement. He feeds us. We come to pray. We open our hearts to him. He comes into us. He works at a deep level in our hearts if we let him in. Jesus must be our sustenance. Apart from other things that we need, such as material food, we need to be spiritually sustained. Now, to top this all off, Jesus outdid himself because he gives us his own flesh and blood to eat and drink. This, of course, is the Eucharist. Now, some of the criticisms of the Eucharist, I've heard this even in modern times, but it goes back as an ancient one, that Catholic people are engaging in some kind of cannibalism because they're eating flesh and drinking blood. So the Church countered that by dismissing anybody from the Mass who was yet fully initiated, so that the person wouldn't get the wrong idea. How do we counter that suggestion? We receive his body and blood, but in forms conducive to eating, meaning normally the food forms of these elements do not change. The hidden substance changes. So I'll give you an example. In 700, a priest was offering Mass at a place called Lanciano, Italy, which interestingly enough is the Italian word for lance. Jesus was lanced in his side. But what happened was he said the words of consecration. This is my body, which will be given up for you. This is the chalice of my blood, and so forth. And the elements visibly changed into flesh and blood. These elements are present today in Lanciano. Nobody consumed them because they're not in forms fit for human consumption. Doctors have examined the flesh, the specimen of flesh that came from this Mass. It's human cardiac tissue. They can't explain how it was cut in precisely the way it was cut, because no surgeon in the 8th century could have done that. It's living tissue. The blood type is AB. AB is a rare blood type that is found commonly among Semitic peoples. Jesus had type AB blood. It's on the Shroud of Turin, too. And the blood is in 5 masses in a crystal chalice. Again, living tissue, human tissue, no refrigeration, no chemicals to preserve it. Blood decomposes very fast if it's not refrigerated. So for centuries, these elements have been one example of the reality of what we speak about when we talk about the Eucharist. That mostly we don't see the change, but it does happen. The miracles of the Eucharist remind us of this. Now, several years ago in the parish, we had a photographic display of miracles of the Eucharist down through the centuries. Very interesting. Go on the internet and type in miracles of the Eucharist. They're all different, and they all support our faith. Now, where do we obtain the teaching? John chapter 6. You can read it. It's what we're covering at Masses this Sunday, the next Sunday, and so forth. But Jesus talks about giving his body to eat and his blood to drink. Very specifically, he never corrects anybody who was upset with him for indicating these things. Normally, Jesus would correct people if they misunderstood him. Oh, I wasn't talking about real water. I was talking about the Holy Spirit. Or, when I talk about having food, I'm talking about my Father's will. I do my Father's will. In this case, he did not chase people down the road who left him. That's the subject for next week's gospel. He was very consistent. Now, as Catholic people, we have the Mass. The Mass is a great gift. It was a brilliant idea that Jesus came up with. What it does is it makes present his sacrifice of the cross. It doesn't multiply it. It simply makes it present in an unbloody way for generations to come. And all around the globe, within the 24-hour period, somewhere there's a Mass going on. Padre Pio, who was an Italian stigmatist, he was a priest. He had the wounds of Jesus on his body. He died in about 1967, said, "A day without the Mass is like a day without the sun," meaning a cataclysmic disaster. Very important in the life of the world that we have the ongoing celebration of the Eucharist at different parts of the globe. The lives of the saints are very instructive. One particular woman went to Mass. She was not a Catholic, but somebody said to her, in kind of a disparaging way, he wasn't a Catholic either, when the priest held up the host, he said, "That's what they," meaning Catholics, call the real presence. And it stung her. She thought, the real presence. So she took instructions in the Catholic faith. She ended up becoming the founder of the Catholic school system in the U.S. We know her as St. Elizabeth Seton, but it was the Eucharist. It was her faith in the Eucharist that did this. Now, a week ago or so, I had a funeral here, and whenever there's a funeral, we get people from all over, which is understandable. And before the funeral began, a lady was sitting in the front, took out her cell phone and started yakking. Now, I'm not defending what she did. It was very inappropriate, but I can explain it. She wasn't a Catholic. The reason I mention it is because most non-Catholic churches do not have a tabernacle with the body and blood of Christ in it. We do. It's very important to know what we have as Catholics. And I would urge people to, again, exercise the proper etiquette, genuflecting before the tabernacle. praying, coming in outside of Mass time, the body and blood of Christ is here. Pray, it's Jesus. Talk to him, unburden our hearts. And then, of course, for communion, we make sure we're always prepared. Receive reverently. Fast for food and drink except for water for 1 hour before communion. And if anybody is conscious of having committed a serious sin, the person really needs to go to confession, because otherwise, before going to communion, because otherwise it's a sacrilege. St. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 11, whoever eats and drinks unworthily eats and drinks a judgment unto himself. That's in the Bible. John 6 is part of the Bible. The Eucharist is indicated in the Scriptures. And finally, Jesus said, whoever eats and drinks body and blood will have life eternal. He will raise him up on the last day. Think about that. We will be raised from death if we live lives as regular communicants. That's a wonderful prospect. So we should cherish our faith, live our faith, love our faith.